Okay, great. Well, thanks, guys, for attending. I know everybody's busy this time of year, all the time during the year. But I wanted to have an opportunity to share a person that I've, the experience of a person I've been working with for several years now, which I have a lot of respect for based on, one, the knowledge that Ben brings to a marketing mindset. But what I love about Ben is the way he's able to use an analytical approach on how to better target and use media dollars for a higher return in your media dollars. One way he does that is through leveraging big data and to a marketing strategy, so you can be a lot more effective. We've been working with Ben for the last couple of years on some analytical, case studies. Some of that data he'll be using in the presentation today. And then we're also working on other initiatives with Ben as far as how do we enhance the inbound caller experience through using big data analytics on the scripting side when our agents actually pick up a call. So I thought it would be a good idea because big data is a pretty broad, and popular name that's pushed in the industry. And I was hoping that Ben, the time that we have today, would help to be able to give you guys a better understanding of what big data is and the development of it, and actually how you guys might be able to leverage it to enhance, your clients' campaigns, your existing campaigns, or other things that you might be looking at as far as optimizing marketing dollars in response. So with that, Ben, I'll hand it over to you, and you can kind of, do your stuff. So thanks, Ben, for making time for us today.
Absolutely, and thanks, Tony, for the introduction. And one thing I want to tell everyone is when we do a webinar, we are always so happy when it gets recorded because I always try to squeeze in as much content as I can, and we go very quickly, and oftentimes people tell me that they go back and they see a particular part that was of interest to them and can play back the recording and get some benefit from that. Because we only have about 50 minutes with Q&A at the end, I'm going to cover a lot of information very quickly, but I've tried to make it as visual as possible, and I'm also going to try to be able to take and use some examples. So I know a lot of you are buying electronic media, both spot radio and television and national radio and television, and I'm trying to make this more or as focused on media buying, but at the same time being able to realize that there may be people on the call that are doing other kinds of digital marketing or Facebook marketing or AdWords or direct mail or any other form of direct response. So you can see my level of being involved in the industry has been quite extensive. I joke about it. I say I've worked with everyone from mobile homes to funeral homes, but it really is pretty much true. And I have discovered a mantra that it's not about what you're selling. It's about understanding the people that are buying what you're selling and crafting messages that strike a responsive chord with them and placing them in media that they will respond to. In order to be able to do that, where we start is with our big data. We have 253 million active consumer records, 700 million historical consumer records, 520 million emails, and literally billions of combinations of IP address linked to zip code. That's the heart of what we use to be able to do our data analytics. There's up to 1,000 data points per household. We work with over 40 different contributing licensors. They're names that you would instantly recognize, like Experian, Axiom, Nielsen Claritas, Ethnic Technologies, the U.S. Census Bureau, TomTom Drive Time, all of those type of data points that are licensed and appended to our file. And you have all examples I'm using here are just things like age of an individual, income, net worth, language preference, all of that help us build both psychographic models of the people buying a product, but also geographic models as well. And we maintain all of the typical, what would be called in the business hotline files, such as new movers and new parents, and recently divorced, because these are circumstances that clearly affect someone's behavior and are triggers for them to be a consumer of a product. Big companies use big data every day to gain market share, and political candidates use big data every day to win elections, and largely big data and the use of it was attributed to a great extent on the outcome of the 2012 presidential election. And I want to talk now about how we use our big data to build marketing models to help businesses of all sizes maximize net revenue. And all of this will have a very strong direct response application. The variables that we see are demographics and psychographics, the type of dwelling, the geographic proximity to the business, the timing. You can have someone that is 100% qualified in the next year, but they're not going to buy today. They're going to buy next week or next month. Frequency. We all know the adage, reach tells, frequency sells. Circumstantial triggers, which we discussed just a few minutes ago, like divorce, new child, newlywed, and the message. Not all of these are present in every circumstance. For instance, trade area probably isn't that important when you're talking about drive time. Trade area and proximity is not that important when you're talking about a national campaign. Demographics versus psychographics. Demographics are the basics that you might get from the census: age, children, income, ethnicity. It's basic stuff. It certainly has value, but you can have two people that are born the same year with the same number of children, the same amount of income, the same ethnicity, the same language. They can live right across the street from each other, and they spend their money on two very, very different items. And whereas psychographics takes into consideration what kind of people that are demographically identical but maybe psychographically very different in the case of life stages, or if someone is a heavy transactor and a large consumer footprint and they are buying anything and everything and approaching life with an open wallet, someone who's commute, or acculturation, techno-adoption, how technically savvy is someone, going from urban to rural. All of those things impact how someone's purchasing behaviors will be. And they're not necessarily neighborhood-based. And as I was alluding earlier, here you have neighborhood houses that I tried to find a clip art of something that looked as identical as possible. But yet inside of those houses, you've got one person that's interested in something completely different for their discretionary income than any of the other three. So the psychographics kind of dispel the notion of birds of a feather flock together. It's still reasonable to assume that when you don't know anything else, but if you have the ability to go down to the individual level, you can find that people that live right next door to each other are vastly different in terms of being your customer. My mantra, know your trade area, know your customers, and build a marketing model to leverage the difference. It's going to especially be useful from a Spanish-speaking Hispanic marketing standpoint, in that it is not just people who speak Spanish that market is very diverse from a psychographic standpoint, and that diversity of who is and is not the best customer and which markets reflect a higher concentration of those best segments for any particular product, we're going to see in a minute very sharply. And we talked a little bit about the circumstantial triggers, which are another thing that affect purchasing. We also talked about the fact that with circumstantials, you can have two people in the same place in life, like newlyweds, and they'll behave extremely different in terms of how they respond. We've talked about timing, someone that's 100% qualified to buy in the next 12 months. During any given period of time, like a month, less than 10% will buy this month. So we take that into account in our model building as well. Psychographic segmentation, which I wanted to get to very quickly, is, and specifically looking at breaking the U.S. Hispanic Spanish-speaking market into 48 lifestyle clusters and 5 levels of acculturation. And I'm real specific here when I say the U.S. Hispanic Spanish-speaking market, because one of the things that I see happening is counting the entire census of anybody who self-selects Hispanic is part of a very large population base that is substantially higher percentage of any market than the true Spanish-speaking, Spanish-dominant Hispanic population that is consuming Spanish-speaking media and is the true universe that we're going to reach. So for the purposes of this discussion going forward, I'm not looking at U.S. Census level of people who checked Hispanic. Many of these people would not necessarily and don't speak Spanish and don't engage in Spanish language media. We're just looking at the universe of the Spanish-speaking market or Spanish preferred that are the most likely consumers of Spanish media, and then comparing that with the different products that Tony has been kind enough to let us share some top-level data with. And there's a lot of sources for psychographic segmentation. I've touched on them before. You're familiar with Axiom, Experian, I'm sure KBM and iBehavior and Nielsen-Claritas. For the purposes of what I did today, I did use Axiom data. I have much of this data in-house, and I license from 3 of the 4. My experience has been that overall Axiom does provide the highest lift, which I define as the smallest percentage of a given market that yields the largest percentage of revenue. But certainly Experian, KBM, and Nielsen-Claritas are all very fine providers of data, and the answers might differ slightly. But if you've got any of those systems that you're already using, everything I'm saying using with Axiom data could be, there's an equivalent in those other services as well. This is a measure of Hispanic acculturation level 1, which is within the Axiom universe. That is a look at people who are most acculturated toward the American values on a 5-point score. And you can see that the red-hot states have over 8% of the Spanish-speaking Hispanic population in those states, or at the highest of the most Americanized 1 level of acculturation. By contrast, blue is the least concentration of Spanish-speaking Hispanics. Now, keep in mind, this is a percentage, so this makes no presumption. California obviously has an extremely significant Spanish-speaking Hispanic population. It's blue because of the Spanish-speaking Hispanic population in California, less than 2% are acculturation level 1. Now, if we look at that same chart, and the reason why this matters is in some products you can see that acculturation levels 1 or 2 or 5 are significantly more likely to buy a particular product. If that's true, then there are markets with higher concentrations of those segments that would make sense to get essentially more media coverage. This looks at the same level of acculturation, but this time I think somebody might need to mute. This looks at the same level of acculturation, but based on Nielsen DMAs, or dominant market areas. And you can see, for example, that South Texas, most of California, and all of South Florida are deep blue, having less than 3% of the Hispanic Spanish-speaking population base in those markets being at that level of acculturation 1. You can see that most of the acculturation level of 1 is within the areas of the upper Midwest and into the West. Now, some of those markets may have, again, small percentages of Hispanic population to begin with, but they are more represented to be acculturation level 1. As you start to go through these and move on down to acculturation level 2, you see a very different picture throughout all of the states, and then you see a very different picture for acculturation level 2 for the DMAs.
Talked with Science. I wanted to let you know in the conversation.
I'm sorry, can everyone please mute themselves?
Whoever just joined should probably mute.
Kind of on the line. I think it's on that.
And I would just say that since this is something that is being recorded, you can go through and see all of the states and slow this down and look at that. But notice how when we start looking at HA3, which is a mid-level of acculturation, all of the extremely high-density Spanish-speaking states like California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas start to pop out as being extremely higher concentrations of HA3, which is, again, middle on a 5-point score of acculturation. You can also see that how that plays out on DMA. And as we move on more toward, and keep in mind, as we go to higher numbers, 4 and 5, that's where we have the people that are most looking toward the acculturation of the native country and have likely had a lower tenure of residence. You can see by the time we get to HA4, again, we're seeing the strength of California, Arizona, and Texas, but we're also starting to finally see Florida make a play, and we know that Florida is a very substantial Spanish-speaking Hispanic market. And you can just toggle back and forth and see by the time we get to the DMAs, we're starting to see, especially in South Florida, some heat with the HA4s. And in South Texas, you're seeing a lot of heat with that group that's more acculturated toward the native country. For the group that's most acculturated toward native country versus the U.S., you can see that Florida is now red hot, along with Arizona and California, where more than 15% of the population that is Spanish-speaking Hispanic by state falls into that category. By DMA, it is a slightly different story, and you can see that Northern California is substantially less of the native acculturated versus Southern California, and that really the markets in Texas that have that distinction are the large markets of Dallas up there in the top that's red, along with Houston and the Rio Grande Valley, McAllen, Harlingen, and Laredo. South Florida, as you see, is also quite red at this point. Now, you say, this is interesting, but how do I apply this? Well, if we look at this, this is from Tony's data, and this is sales from a kitchen-related product. And you can see that the acculturation level of 5 is responsible for 16% of the Spanish-speaking Hispanic individuals in this country. But on this particular product, it was responsible for 21% of sales. And then you can see that acculturation levels 3 and 4 were pretty much at par with their population base. And acculturation level 2 and 1 substantially underachieved on this product. So if we take that and say, what does that look like toward another product, you can see that it's completely different. In the case of home improvement, only 2.6% of the individuals that are Spanish-speaking Hispanic in this country are acculturation level 1, but they represented 5.8% of the home improvement database. And in this particular case, with a home improvement product, even though the huge 36% of the sales were derived from HA3 from an acculturation standpoint, the real sweet spot from the marketing standpoint is HA1 and 2. They combined were responsible for about 34% of the sales, but they combined were only less than 20% of the population. So you can see as well that in terms of the home improvement product, areas that are strong with HA4 and HA5 would not particularly be as good a choices for media purchases, for example, or zoned cable buys, or in areas where you have large cities where you can zone cable, as areas that have strong HA1 and HA2. Same thing could be said for a beauty product. And in this particular case, again, the big tonnage is on that 35% of HA3 that's buying the product. But you have 35% of the sales also coming from the combined total of HA1 and 2, which are less than 20% of the market. So in this particular example, the HA3s are the largest segment of Spanish-speaking Hispanics in the country, and they are the largest segment of this particular data file. But in terms of being able to spend 20% of the market, that is the HA1 and 2s combined, are yielding virtually the same amount of sales as 35% of the market that's HA3, and substantially more sales than HA4 and 5 combined, which represent 45% of the market. So these efficiencies can be exploited, and the most obvious example is if you go back to the charts on your rewind, you can see DMAs are markets that are very strong with HA1 and 2 and maybe very weak with HA4 and 5, and they can be targeted because, and just an example that I would know from memory, an HA4 and 5 market might be a market in South Texas or South Florida, and for this product, the HA1s and 2s, it might be better to put the media money in a market that has a strong level of 1s and 2s, such as the area in Chicago, for example. But beyond just those 5 levels of acculturation, we also are able to look at 48 lifestyle clusters. And this gets very, very drilled down because when we look at a segment from a lifestyle cluster standpoint, we are looking at a particular group of people, and based on the fact that the entire universe is Spanish-speaking Hispanics. We're not counting anybody that is Hispanic and speaks English. We're not counting anybody that is any other ethnicity. We're just looking at that universe. And when we look at that, and I'm going to escape from my PowerPoint for one moment to show you this Excel file because it's a little bit too detailed to be able to put on a PowerPoint. But I'm picking a cluster 22, and they all have names like Saving Traditions. And this particular cluster is 100% HA5. It is the best segment on a proportionality ratio for purchasing kitchen offers in Tony's data. And you can see the level of drill down that we have for this one segment. We know the mean age. We know the index of over-delivery. They're largely older people. We know their language usage, heavily skewed toward Spanish-dependent and bilingual Spanish-preferred, very lightly skewed toward English-dependent or English. We know their income level. We also know the dominant Hispanic country that they come from, which in this case, huge overrepresentation of Cuban versus slight underrepresentation of Mexico, and also huge overrepresentation of other Latin American countries for this particular segment. We know education level. We know they're split 50-50 on whether they have children present, and we know as well that what the ages of children can be in this segment as well. We also know occupation, and we know marital status, and a key thing, length of residence. So we can actually, using all of this data, we can look at a particular product that we've sold, and we can determine what is the model of the people that are buying. It's not just Spanish-speaking Hispanics. It is a certain level of a segment as far as children present, as far as market value of home, as far as net worth, as far as occupation, as far as years in the country, as far as acculturation. And all of that can be used to get to the point, which was said in the promotional piece, where we find less than 30% of the population that is Spanish-speaking Hispanic purchasing at least half of the products in terms of revenue. Now back to the PowerPoint, and I'll show you some examples of that. And I think I made the mistake of saying I was going to start it from the beginning, so apologies for having to go through a few slides here. But this is data from the kitchen product, and you can see our 22s are the top group. They were 1.6% of the Spanish-speaking Hispanic individuals in this country, but they're 4.4% of the people who bought. So that has a 273 index. That just means that they're 2.73 times more concentrated within the database than they are within the U.S. Spanish-speaking population. Now, what's interesting is this whole group of segments is just over 30% of the individuals, Spanish-speaking Hispanic, but 49.3% of this particular database. So every one of these segments overachieves. There's quite a bit of difference between a 22 that's 2.73 times more likely to buy, but even down to an 18, you're still dealing with 16% more likely to buy. And because we have the entire file of addresses, we can map all of these combined segments and do a heat map, which we did here, which shows for kitchen products, here are your hot spots in the U.S. by state and by DMA. And by the same token, the bottom 30% of Spanish-speaking yields only 17% of this customer base for the kitchen. So these would be avoid areas. The red-hot areas here are markets that we probably wouldn't meet with a lot of success in because they have such a high concentration of the segments that don't do well with this product. And just because someone does well with kitchen doesn't mean they're going to do well with home improvement or health and beauty. In fact, the home improvement market was even more rarefied. And keep in mind, I want to say again, in case anyone joined late, we're not looking at any universe of percentage of individuals other than people who are Hispanic and speak Spanish as their primary language. We're not considering people who are not Hispanic or don't speak Spanish. So there you have a group here. Segment 32 is a very tiny portion of individuals, but they buy a lot of this particular product. And they have an index of 8.1 times more concentrated within that data file than within the overall U.S. Spanish-speaking market. So in this particular product, it took only 21% of the Spanish-speaking population to yield 50% of the database. And keep in mind, that means that these people, the other 80% are contributing the other 50%. So these people here, if you can identify them in target markets where they're rich in terms of percentages of the concentration of the total Spanish population, Spanish-speaking population base, you can target markets for media that are going to have a lot higher concentration of these segments, and you can avoid markets that have a lower concentration. What that looks like on the state level, obviously no, you're not going to have a lot of success targeting Spanish-speaking Hispanics in Wyoming or Montana because this is a percentage. But you do see when you look at markets by DMA that the best markets, the hottest markets, for example, in Texas would be San Antonio and Austin, and the Rio Grande Valley wouldn't be as good for this home improvement product. The Bay Area of San Francisco would be very good, but all of New Mexico and Arizona are only about average. As far as the worst 21%, that group yielded only 5% of the customer base as an aggregate. Those markets there would probably be a void at the state level, and even more so when you look at the DMAs, those markets would be questionable. Now, the thing about it is you would say, well, what if you have a market that shows up on both the red hot for buying and the red hot for avoid? Well, what that means is that market has a lot of the people that are most likely to buy your product that are in the top 21%, but they also have a lot of people that are in the bottom 21%. So that's a market that that you overachieve with both the non-target and the target. You still obviously would buy that market, like for instance LA, but you would certainly have more efficiency if you targeted markets that were extreme. The best ideal would be you find a market that has red-hot concentration of the 21% that got you to 50% and is ice blue with the 21% that was the worst group that only got 5% of sales. If we look at the final product, which is beauty, that was a similar situation where we were able to identify these segments that 22.8% yielded 51% of the customer base. And there you have that by state. Again, this is not by tonnage. So if we look by tonnage, you would obviously not be looking at states like Wyoming or Montana. But you know that from a standpoint of this particular product, that by state, Texas and Florida are average, and Arizona is actually below average as a function of the per capita concentration of the target. If you look here, you can see what are the hotter markets. This particular product looks like the Albuquerque and West Texas markets would be some good areas, as well as the areas in the upper part of the Midwest, and maybe this product doesn't have as high a concentration of these segments in some of the California markets that we would usually see. As far as the worst performing for this particular group, that only brought in, that bottom 24% only brought in 6.2% of the customers. And you can see where that non-target is, and this is probably a very good example, because you can see that LA for this particular product would be a potential strong non-target, but then when you look at here, it also doesn't have a high population of the target. So going back and forth and looking at a market and seeing the segments that are there allow you to make better decisioning on a CPM-based or a CPA-based media buy in terms of how much qualitative you're reaching for the dollar. I think that one of the things that we saw from, and this I think was kind of a composite list, we looked at all the markets with 250,000 plus Spanish-speaking population, and we found that they varied almost sixfold in response as a function of the population. This was another group of data from Tony's call center. And you can see that Los Angeles is a very strong market. It's 22.4% of total households in this case, but only 19% of sales. Miami, on the other hand, is 9% of households, but 16% of sales. And of the 20,676,000 households that that comprise this complete universe, you're seeing in the top markets, these top markets with more than 250,000 in Spanish-speaking population, that accounts for 15,679,000 of the 20 million. So that's a little bit over 3/4 of the total population are in these markets. But you can see that it's interesting that a market like San Antonio is so underachieving and a market like Miami is so overachieving, or Chicago. And those may be, that could be dependent upon the media buy. That could be dependent on the circumstances with San Antonio is a small market. It's not an efficient market. Chicago and San Antonio both have approximately the same number of Spanish-speaking Hispanics, but whether that plays a role in it, this definitely could be a media-driven decision, or it could be something where these markets like San Antonio or El Paso could do better if they had more media exposure. States with 250,000 Spanish-speaking population, you can see again by state, it's the same 20.6 million, but 17.7 million of the 20.6 million are within these states that you see here, and the relative achievement of the states are almost a fourfold variance. And at this point in time, I would just point out something that I think you all know that the higher the index, the less effort it is to sell. It's not saying that you won't sell somebody, in this case, that has a 43 index, but it's going to be a whole lot less work to sell somewhere where you've got a 153 index or someone where you've got a higher index. There's less friction to buy. There's more affinity. You can sell, it's as much work to sell 1,000 people that have a 10 index as it is 100 people with a 100 index as it is 10 people with an index. It requires the same amount of theoretical effort within terms of exposure, because the 1,000 index, being 10 times more likely to buy, requires less reach, less frequency, is more forgiving. They want to buy. They have an affinity for the product. If you've got a 10 index, you're going to sell some of them. If you've got 1 million people, you're still going to sell more product than if you have 10,000 people at par. From my standpoint, I think at this point that concludes everything that I had planned to show you. I can open up for questions, and then we can go back and review a particular slide if you wish to, and we have probably about 10 or 15 minutes for that. So, Tony, if you want to open the floor for questions, we certainly can.
Yeah, that'd be great. Ashley, can you do that?
Sorry. So everyone has the ability to talk that's on the phone, so.
Okay. Well, just so you guys know, one of the things that we've been looking at as far as using big data, and I mean, there's a lot of information on here as far as, well, how do I adjust my media buys potentially, or how do I, post-market target better or communicate better to the Hispanic? What we're trying to do is, leverage technology so we can identify who's calling on the front end of a call, so we could build smarter scripting technology based on, and routing based on the probability of that person buying more or being a more challenging person to sell to, or having a higher probability to buy a bigger package or bundle on the front end versus spending a lot of time on a call and potentially not having a high average ticket or conversion. So we're looking at how do we leverage technology and big data analytics to enhance the call center experience and conversion and average ticket for our clients. How do we optimize that opportunity? So that's what we've been working on the past year as far as how do we integrate both to make more money for our clients.
So, Tony, this is Michelle. So just a quick question so I can understand that. So you're saying that you're actually implementing this data at the beginning of the call, and you're somehow essentially maybe doing like an API or something to ping a database to then be able to route the call appropriately?
That's correct. That's what we've been working towards. Probably won't be done until the end of the year because there's a lot of analytics that have to be, played out in that. But that's our goal, is to be a smarter center.
And if I can just elaborate a little bit on that, because I've done this with numerous other call centers and websites. The concept is that it's an API call, and we do have, and Tony would hit our database like our other clients do, and in so doing, we would return key factors, like, for instance, if we're selling the kitchen product and we have someone coming in that's segment 22 that we know is our very best segment, they may see a customized landing page on a website, or they may get some kind of an offer with the call center that somebody that doesn't look like the right, isn't as likely to buy, would get maybe the existing offer, and when they decline to purchase, they would be scored, and we might say, they were calling in for kitchen offer, but they look like the kind of folks that buy a lot of health and beauty, so our fallback script is going to be health and beauty, even though they called in on this other offer, or it could be vice versa. But as the person, and we don't use self-reported data because it's notoriously inaccurate and everybody rushes to the middle of the bell curve. The rich say they're poor, the poor say they're richer, the young say they're older, etc. What we do is we look at the data from the person's household file, and we return a code of the likelihood of that person being a good candidate for the product they called in on, or for a different upsell, or even if they're appropriate for what type of programs. If they're good, if they show segments that are good for continuity, might be shown an offer that has something that's a 3 or 6 pay plan. If we see that that particular segment has a high percentage of chargebacks and declines after 1 or 2 times, we might choose to sell them a lower offer that requires a higher upfront if that segment appears to be responsive to that. And it's all data driven, and as the data gets back into the feedback loop, our decisioning is made smarter both by geographics. Are people more responsive in deeply rural areas, or more responsive in small towns, or more responsive in urban areas? Are they more responsive by acculturation? Are they more responsive by age or country of origin? All of those are data points that can affect the decisioning model and where we go. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
And the other thing is, in today's world, there's the multimedia. Ben's got a lot of experience in mail and how to optimize lists, mail buying lists that people buy. How do you actually segment that list out, and using data segments like this to actually cleanse that list so you have a richer list that you're mailing to. I mean, that's just another way of trying to target the Hispanic enculturation level 4 and 5 in certain areas, so you have a higher penetration of potential buyers on your mail campaign. It could be even done on radio, as far as how do you optimize your radio campaigns, depending on when you're buying it, time of year, and what markets.
And in radio, since Arbitron obviously is a zip code-based diary or people meter type environment, all of that data is available by zip code. And if we see that a particular level of acculturation or segments are strong in a particular zip code, and those zip codes correspond to the strength of one competitive radio station over another, that might affect in a particular market that, what stations, there are, I think, at least 4 or 5 major Spanish language stations, for instance, in Chicago, and they differ very significantly on a heat map into what zip codes they're strong with, and those correlate with levels of acculturation and country and language assimilation. So those are applications that can definitely, the presumption oftentimes is if you can't go down to the individual level and you're working with broadcast, whether it be radio, TV, or cable, that you can't utilize the big data that does rely on individual and household data. But it can even be to the level that in a market like Chicago, you might have 20 or 30 cable interconnects that you could buy, and you might choose to buy only 4 or 5 of them for a particular product because the true strength of that product is toward a more acculturated group, and therefore you know that the hot zones for that level of acculturation are not just all 20 Chicago zones. 10 of the 20 may not have significant Hispanic population density in them, and another 5 that have high density may have an acculturation level that is slightly different than your sweet spot for that product, but the other 3 or 4 or however many may have very high concentrations of, from an acculturation standpoint or a segment standpoint, the kind of clusters that we know are responsible for much of the revenue on one of the products, and you might be running different zones in Chicago for a kitchen product and a beauty product, or even 2 different beauty products.
Ben, I had a question for you regarding maybe some of these are common questions that I had, but I'm launching a new product, and it's in a I guess a beauty category, and I don't have any past data as far as who to target. Is there any way I can use data sets that a company like you or other companies would have to help optimize a mail, radio, or TV campaign? Or do I have to start with a database?
Well, you don't have to start with a database, and the thing that it will be easier, faster, and less expensive if you do than if you don't. But if you're a startup, by definition, you don't have a customer file. We can do it one of two ways. One is that we can do it with looking at similar products that maybe the company has worked with and pulling together a proxy saying, well, we know these segments, these levels of acculturation, these geographic areas did well for this product. Therefore, we believe it will do well for this similar product. And then we can test our theory by going out there and launching. The other way to do it, which is just if there's nothing out there that's anything like this before, you cast the widest net possible. I believe the mantra, if in doubt, don't leave them out, because we don't know. And when you start to intuit a model, you're really at a disadvantage if you're not doing it based on evidence and you're just based on gut, because you may say, I really think this market is going to be primarily less affluent, younger, single, less acculturated Spanish-speaking Hispanics, and therefore I'm going to go into markets like Miami or L.A. To test. And it turns out that you intuited it wrong. It's a market of just slightly more acculturated, slightly more affluent, slightly less Spanish-dependent, and that type of segment is more concentrated in a market like Chicago, and you would have been better testing it in Chicago than testing it in Miami. That's why I say, if in doubt, test the full levels of acculturation, the full levels of language assimilation, and then as the data comes in, that's going to cost more from a media buying standpoint, but as the data comes in, you let the data drive the decision, and if you have it on the back end with a call center where people, when they come into the system, they're being scored, and we know that we've generated somebody here that did not buy this product, this launch product, so that's going to count for that segment not purchasing this, but we know from our experience that we have this other proven product that this particular segment will like. So it all is not lost if you target broadly, because when they call in and say no, then we can sell them something else that they might have more of an affinity for. If they don't call in at all, well, that's certainly something that we're going to reflect as well. And over time, the model gets smarter. It just costs more media dollars than if you could do an analysis on the front end.
So, Ben, being in the big data industry as long as you have, and as quick as, and dynamic as the technology is changing, what do you see that's going to affect the market in the next year or 2 years out when it comes to big data and how that's going to be a game changer moving forward, even more so than it has been already?
I think one of the things is that the big difficulty right now in big data is that right now it is not in a user-friendly format, and you wind up having a repository of information that requires IT to get a request from marketing and query the file, and sometime later you get the answer to a question that you may no longer need to know. The ability to be able to query the data in near real time and at the marketing person's level in a process where the data can be summarized and action can be taken on it immediately, in the same way that those of you who are buying direct response television can change your buy the next morning based on what happened the night before. That is the level of data flexibility that big data has to have in order to be adopted by the CMO or the direct response marketer. And when that happens, the direct response marketers and the CMOs that do adapt to the big data will have very powerful tools in their hand. And to illustrate the point, 1% of Google's advertisers are 99% of their revenue. That means the other 99% of their advertisers are the remaining 1%. That is an extreme example of what happens when you introduce a disruptive technology to a market and people know how to use it very well, and most of the people don't know how to use it at all or not well. And that's why you see most of the AdWords campaigns start and stop and go away. If you have a campaign that is constantly running and is at the top of the click position and it's getting clicks and relevance, you know if it's running forever, it's because it's working. And that electronic media has been protected by the fact that the general consensus has been to be able to put a buy out there in a key market at a low CPM or a low cost per acquisition, and you really didn't have the ability to go into the demographics and psychographics to be able to say people in Spanish-speaking Hispanics in San Antonio are 3 times more likely to buy this product than Spanish-speaking Hispanics in Miami. That's about to change, and with that change, I think the media buyers that look at the fact that they don't buy the whole cable zones for Chicago, but the targeted zones that look better psychographically, those are huge opportunities to take big data and use it within the markets, even to the level in some markets like LA, where Time Warner is doing the experiment with being able to deliver directly to the individual at the set-top box level. That's going to be extremely enhanced with being able to have big data to give to Time Warner to tell them for a launch product what type of people to be looking for on that kind of delivery platform.
Are there any other questions, or because I can keep on asking you more questions, Ben. I guess I'm going to ask one more question. And it relates to the online side of it. And I know you work with some online companies, but, targeting the U.S. Hispanic, some people say it's tricky because they're bilingual and they live in 2 different worlds, as we know, and majority of them are potentially using, English search engines. Can you tell us a little bit about what you see in targeting the U.S. Hispanic on the Internet?
Well, if you're looking at whether you're using English or Spanish in terms of search, I think one of the things that's the easiest thing to do with any kind of AdWords or digital platform is to do an A/B split test. And certainly the more your market for a particular product is skewed toward the 5 on the level of acculturation and Spanish dominant or Spanish speaking only on the level of language assimilation, then if you do that A/B split, then you will see greater strength in terms of Spanish language site and Spanish language search than you would if your campaigns were more appealing to a more acculturated English speaking or bilingual, English preferred or bilingual, pure bilingual Hispanic. I think the challenge is that it's just a simple A/B test, and certainly from a cost per click rate, the Spanish side in America, in U.S., is going to be significantly less expensive on Google or any of the other Spanish websites than the English, because you're getting a very targeted group, and very few people. I have looked at so many databases that it just strikes me that I see the language preference code, and I see that people are fighting the language barrier to go to an English website when it's obviously clear that they would prefer to communicate in Spanish based on the data, but there's not a Spanish site available for them to buy this product, and they're buying it and fighting the language barrier. I think in typical cases where we've made recommendations to that kind of e-commerce business to have a Spanish language site and to promote it in Spanish, we've seen some very, very good results, because you're now getting a website that is giving people the content in the language that they're most comfortable with. And, you can always use the Google translation page, but it's still doesn't quite work as well as having it set up right in the first place.
And I'm going to leave with one other question that came to mind, and thanks for that, because that was insightful. The other thing in direct response is direct response driving the need or the next step of direct response, which is retail. So how would a marketer actually use big data or in coalition with the retail chains that they market to? How might they be able to leverage that to have a stronger play in selling more products to the retailers?
Well, if you're trying to get into the retail stores, one of the things that can be very useful, especially if you have a store that is very much does market segmentation, is to certainly what we've done is to take the neighborhood of the store, which has a defined trade area, and basically show to the retailer that their footprint of stores has the same psychographic segmentation or similar psychographic or enough to make a case that these stores ought to be our test market to work together on. Picking the test market for a product to go into retail and making it successful and test stores is very, very important to the entire company taking it on. If we know, for example, that we have a store, we have a product that does well with H1s and H2s on the assimilation index, then we probably don't want to suggest that we go into the into a retail store in locations that are dominated within the 10-minute drive or the 20-minute drive by H4 and 5. Vice versa is true as well. So we could actually, if somebody is trying to take a product that's successful in direct response and online, offline into retail, being able to know who's already buying it and then being able to handpick the test markets that are going to be doing the best, that's tremendous for them to make sure that they don't pick the wrong market and the retailer get the misperception that the product doesn't do well in retail when in reality the product didn't do well in a badly picked test market.
So, quick question. Oh, sorry about that. The data that you're collecting from, say, the Tonys of the world, does that get aggregated as part of the information that you ultimately then use as an output? I don't know if I'm expressing that correctly.
No, I think I understand your question. Let me just say it back. Tony's data is confidential to Tony. He can choose to share it with somebody else as a marketing partner, but ultimately his data doesn't go back into an aggregate database on our end. There are certain groups out there that do aggregate data of consumer, and all the consumers, retailers agree to share information with stripped out, non-personally identifiable information. You wind up with just, product SKUs and this kind of person that was segment 20 with this level of net worth bought this product, and you can assemble consumer profiles for that. That's been going on with iBehavior and several others for years. What we do is, if Tony, for instance, is working with a lot of different areas, then we can take his data and know that if he's got 4 different beauty products and they all look very similar, that fifth one that he's trying to launch, we can probably make some assumptions about where that's going to be. But as far as the static data that we use for segmentation and analytics, it's got to be based on the full file. So I typically use data elements that have what I call full reporting, so that I don't come back. Like, for instance, if I know that BMW drivers are very likely to buy a product, that's interesting information. But if only 3% of the population drives a BMW, I can't scale on that. So I typically use data points that have 98+% coverage of the U.S. population, or in this case, a Spanish-speaking Hispanic population.
Got it. Thank you.
I think that concludes today. I know we're starting to lose some people. But Ben, I wanted to thank you for preparing and spending some time and just educating the group on the benefits of looking deeper into data segments and how that might be a benefit to a marketer, a media agency, a call center, and so forth. So thank you very much for making the time for us today.
Absolutely, and enjoyed chatting. And if anybody has any questions, my email address is on the screen. And if you do email me, put in the subject line reference to this webinar, because I get a lot of emails, and sometimes I won't recognize or wouldn't recognize a name and wouldn't read the body of the email. I'm bad at that. So definitely, if you do have a question, I'm happy to answer. And it is a nice opportunity to speak with everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yep. Bye, guys.
Thank you.